Welcome to NACD's BoardVision, where leading boardroom advisors, governance professionals, and board directors discuss critical issues related to your responsibilities in the boardroom. I'm Peter Gleason, Managing Director of the National Association of Corporate Directors. I'm joined today by Catherine Bromilow in New York. Catherine's a partner in PwC's Center for Board Governance. Today we'll be discussing two key international issues that directors here in the States need to keep on their radar screens. Thanks for joining me today, Catherine.
Thank you, Peter. It's my pleasure to be here.
There's a lot going on here in Washington these days. With the new Congress in place, the ongoing health care debate, and President Obama's budget challenges, Capitol Hill's a pretty busy place. Congress gave the SEC 1 year to implement Dodd-Frank, and the SEC is continuing with its rulemaking agenda. With that, we expect draft rules to be issued shortly on the independence of both the compensation committees and their advisors. We also expect clawback policies to be released soon. In a recent episode of BoardVision, PwC's John Barry and I discussed the proposed whistleblower rules, and we're going to do our best to keep you up to date on all these issues in future editions of BoardVision. I know PwC follows these and other developments closely, as we do here at NACD. But as important as they are, we can't take our eyes off the international scenes and some changes that are brewing across the globe that can affect boards here in the States. As we've seen over many years, a lot of the governance reform efforts that get their start abroad very often find their way into U.S. boardrooms. Catherine, I know your firm is tracking a variety of international issues. Are there a few that we should be paying attention to right now?
Yes, Peter, there certainly are. In our many meetings and discussions with directors over the past few months, we're seeing great interest in a number of international regulatory developments, and particularly on the possible impact of those developments on U.S. companies. Today I'd like to talk with you about two key developments, and one of them is the new UK Bribery Act. Despite its name, it is important for U.S. companies to pay attention to this act. This act will most probably become effective in 2011, and I say most probably since the implementation date has been postponed twice so far. Nonetheless, it has a very broad scope. It will apply to U.S. companies that have a presence in the U.K., whether that's through a subsidiary, an office, or some kind of other operations. And it will hold companies and individuals liable if they give or receive a bribe, even if that bribe occurs outside of the UK. The Bribery Act in the UK defines bribery broadly, and it doesn't require that someone had to act with corrupt intent in order to be able to hold them liable.
Obviously, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act comes to mind, and we've heard a lot recently that it's raising interest and concern for U.S. companies conducting business around the world. How is this different, and what's critical to understand in the UK Bribery Act?
Well, it's important for directors to understand how far the UK law goes beyond the FCPA, which many directors are familiar with. While the FCPA covers only bribes to government officials, the UK Bribery Act applies to bribes paid to anyone. And the Act's definition of bribery includes receiving as well as giving a bribe in almost any business or governmental circumstances. So this includes bribes to private individuals and to companies. Plus, the UK Act doesn't have a facilitating payments exception, whereas the FCPA makes an exception for payments that companies have to make that facilitate paperwork or other routine government action. The UK Act also makes it an offense if the company fails to prevent bribery, and it prohibits third parties from giving or receiving a bribe on a company's behalf. So as you can see, the Act is far more extensive than the FCPA. And further, if companies are found to have violated the Act, they can be assessed unlimited fines, and individuals can be sentenced for up to 10 years in prison. And that's also possibly more punitive than the U.S. situation. Because if you remember, in the U.S., the federal sentencing guidelines can take into account a company's compliance program when sentencing, and that can be used to reduce the fines and penalties that companies would otherwise pay.
The UK Bribery Act, as it's currently proposed, seems more extensive when compared to the U.S. law. It also seems as though it would be fairly difficult to enforce. Is the UK really committed to enforcing the law? And if so, when does it become effective?
Peter, this law is the UK's first update to their anti-bribery statute in over 100 years. And the UK government is stating that it is committed to having tougher anti-bribery laws. With that said, there is a possibility not a certainty, that we could see it enforced more rigorously than previous UK laws in this area. Having said that, the government did receive significant pushback on the Act, and it has delayed implementation of the law a number of times. Most recently, the Act was to have been effective in April 2011, but a further delay was announced, and at this point, the earliest it can be effective is May 2011.
Okay, since the timeline for enactment may be short, and compounded with the reality that boards and directors here in the States are still working to get their arms around Dodd-Frank rules, what advice are you giving directors in terms of priorities?
Well, if your company operates in the UK, management should ensure it understands the implications and requirements and has a plan to comply, since the penalties are severe. We're advising directors to discuss with management the company's compliance policies for anti-bribery and the effectiveness of education and compliance programs. We're also advising directors to look closely with management at the level of risk in this area, to consider factors like the nature and geographic location of operations, the current economic environment, and whether management is assessing the behaviors of any agents and other third parties the company uses.
This is really a huge issue, and one that all directors on boards of companies with operations in the UK need to be aware of. Catherine, you said at the beginning of the program that PwC is tracking two issues very closely that you wanted to discuss today.
Well, Peter, directors are also looking across the Atlantic for the second key development. The European Commission has been examining whether additional regulation is needed in light of the financial crisis. And while they've looked at other players already, they're now turning their attention to auditors. And so they've just issued a green paper entitled Audit Policy Lessons from the Crisis. Essentially, a green paper is an early-stage consultation document, and this one explores the auditor's current role and how it could be enhanced to contribute to financial stability. While it is a good practice to look at improvements that can be made after a major crisis, there are some concepts that the green paper explores that we at PwC disagree with, concepts that we don't believe will promote audit quality. Some U.S. directors we speak with are now aware of the green paper and are watching to see what impact it could have on their European-based operations. And given the global nature of business and of investor activism, today there's always the possibility that proposals similar to those in the green paper could find their way to the United States.
You know, Catherine, the green paper is something that we at the NACD have been watching as well. We're very concerned that some of the proposals, if eventually adopted, would reduce the role of the audit committee in overseeing the audit, which could undermine corporate governance more broadly. From your perspective, what are some of the specific concepts being discussed?
Sure, Peter. Three concepts in the green paper are particularly troubling. One is to have regulators appoint auditors, which would remove this responsibility from the audit committee. Another is joint audits, and that would require the large audit firms, the Big Four, to share the audit of a company with a smaller firm. For us, this is an issue since it decreases our control over audit quality. And the third concept would call for mandatory rotation of audit firms, an idea that many believe actually harms audit quality. You can imagine PwC has significant concerns with each of these concepts, and we expressed our views in our letter to the European Commission.
NACD and PwC are definitely on the same page on this one. From NACD's perspective, we're concerned with protecting the interest of the directors. Our comment letter to the EC focused on keeping audit decisions in the hands of the audit committee and not undermining the committee or the board, because that's the body that represents and answers to the shareholders.
It's also important to note that the financial crisis was not caused by an audit or a financial reporting failure. So new regulations on the audit profession can't fix financial problems that remain or prevent a new financial crisis. That said, I should point out that there were some areas of the green paper that we agree are worthy of further consideration. For one, the audit needs to change to respond to lessons learned from the financial crisis by increasing transparency of the audit process and extending the scope of the audit. Second, possible changes to audit firm ownership, for example, by allowing outside capital to be invested in the firm, are important and worthy of further look if independence issues can be addressed. Third is taking steps to reduce the risk of audit firm failure, and that's also important, and it could include limiting the damage on a firm network for actions that were caused by only a handful of its partners and staff, as long as there is no evidence of systemic failure by the firm. And finally, limiting excessive private civil liability that could threaten a firm or a network's viability.
So what happens now? What's next for this issue?
Peter, this is the beginning of what promises to be an ongoing dialogue, which may have an impact beyond the European Union. For now, it's important to remember that the final recommendations in the Green Paper on audit policy are not binding, and at this point they're still in flux. The lesson here is that public policy ideas, whether they're good or bad, are no longer limited by regional boundaries, and they can be pretty easily exported. We in the United States should be watching what happens in Europe because it may well put pressure on us for reforms similar to what happens there.
Thank you, Catherine, for joining me today and sharing your insights on these two emerging international issues. Directors of companies with operations both in the UK and the EU really need to stay on top of any new developments in this area and coordinate closely with management as they potentially come to fruition. That wraps up another episode of NACD's BoardVision. For more information, visit NACD's BoardVision page and PwC's Center for Board Governance website. On behalf of NACD and PwC, thanks for joining us.